And then you have the question that was being raised earlier, and it's been raised many times before, and that is, when does regulation of impairment of emotion constitute just one aspect of ADHD? And when would you say, well, no, that's really something else? Take irritability, for example. There's a certain amount of quickness to get irritable that is true of many people, not all people, but many people with ADD. But the irritability of a person just with ADD is more like, it's just a flash that comes, and usually it's over, and often a couple of minutes later they don't even remember what it was about. Think about that and the irritability you see with somebody who really has a bipolar disorder, where it's also tied in, they can't sleep at night and they're too revved up. A variety of ways. The irritability you often see with bipolar disorder when they're in a manic episode is more like a fire hose compared to a garden hose. It's got a lot more pressure behind it. And that's an example of how sometimes these issues like emotional regulation, up to a certain point, you'd say that's part of ADD. Get it beyond that point, and you could argue about where the line should be drawn, then it may look like another disorder. Eric Mick's paper that I spoke about yesterday is an example in terms of the study of irritability and ADHD and bipolar. But Banaszewski and a couple of the other European colleagues wrote about how differences between ADHD and other disorders are often not qualitative, where they're a completely different thing. They're often quantitative, where the other disorder is just a lot more of one particular thing that's beyond the range of what you usually see with ADHD. And so what I'm proposing is that there is a spectrum of emotional regulation problems that we see with ADHD. And, there's sort of normal, everybody's got some troubles with anxiety, worry, depression, obsessionality, irritability, and so forth. And there's a certain amount of it, we'd say, well, that's sort of regular, that's what most people do. With ADHD, it might be moderate. Some of the comorbid disorders, it's big time. And let me give you an example. This is a 12-year-old boy who, since he was very young, had a lot of difficulty with separation. When he was first going to school, he was extremely anxious. And he's now in 7th grade, diagnosed as having ADHD when he was in 4th, but had no medication treatment because his parents were worried about the possible adverse effects. Brought him in for consultation to see me during 7th because of his anxiety and his ADHD. Since early childhood, he'd been so fearful about being away from the family. When he first started kindergarten, he couldn't separate from his mother each day without a lot of tears at school. Since that time, he's been able to go to school regularly, but has had episodes of excessive absences because of vague complaints of headache, stomach ache, or I'm going to throw up. Had a history of difficulty falling asleep, can't get to sleep unless he's in a room with his brother or a parent. And even then, he can't get to sleep until 60 to 90 minutes after he gets into bed. Once in bed, he will not leave bed to go to the bathroom unless a parent or his brother accompanies him. 12 years old. Very fearful of being alone even in daylight. When taking a shower, he often has to interrupt and call out to be sure one of his parents is within earshot. Won't go outside his house to play unless he's got somebody else with him or the family dog. Easily embarrassed, extremely shy, won't go to extracurricular activities, sports, or birthday parties unless one of his parents stays with him, and despite all this, maintains a B+ average in school. So you've got an example here of somebody who's having a lot more trouble with anxiety than is typical for somebody else with ADD who doesn't have that problem. There also are problems with social cluelessness. A lot of folks with ADHD have problems in social relationships. Not all. There are some of them who are delightful with other people. They've got a great sense of humor, a wonderful ability to read other people and to interact with other people. But there are also some who come across as way too intense, too much in a hurry, or too clueless and too isolated. And that can make a lot of trouble because the difficulties are that they don't have quite as much of the emotional intelligence, which is the ability to sort of monitor what they're feeling and what the other person might be feeling, to discriminate among those feelings, and then to use that information to guide their thinking and their action. It's not the same thing as intelligence. Think about professors you've had. Most of us could name a few people who are very, very bright, but you would not want to invite them home for dinner because they just don't know how to talk about anything except that one thing that they're really into. And that makes sense because there are different parts of the brain that do emotional intelligence and general intelligence. We've got a number of studies now which suggest that these are difficulties that a lot of kids with ADHD have in terms of reading where other kids are coming from. And we know that monitoring and self-regulating action has been identified as a problem with many folks with ADHD. I'm going to skip this slide. We don't have enough time. The peer relationships in ADHD, for some kids, no problem. But for others, there's a lot of difficulty. And this is a sample of 13 to 18-year-olds in a study where they had 111 kids with ADHD and 100 without. And those kids were saying to the researcher, look, I just don't have that many friends as most of my friends. There are a lot of people who I get to know them at first, and then they just don't want to bother with me anymore. And sometimes I just screw up relationships. And sometimes that's because of the ADD stuff. And sometimes it's because the emotional intelligence is not that good. And there's a spectrum. And on the one hand, there's sort of regular range, and then on the far end is where we're looking at somebody with Asperger's disorder, where they seem to have an incredibly difficult time being able to empathize with other persons. And that often they have a very unusual set of interests that they're interested in, and then that's all they can talk about. They can't get into anything else with anybody else, and they don't want to listen much to somebody else. They have a difficult time maintaining reciprocity in social relationships. And some of them will strike you as just a little bit odd, but still pretty interesting and decent people. And there are other ones where you say, this person is weird, I do not want to have to deal with them. Let me just give you a couple of simple examples. This is a mother, 13-year-old kid, girl, and she said the kid was doing pretty well in school, but she'd never been able to catch on to how kids get along with other kids. And she said all the kids pick on her daughter, and that it really bothers her because at that school they were not allowed to give out birthday party invitations in a class. And so at the end of the school day, when she was out there to pick up her kid, you could see the girls doling out the invitations to all the other kids, and everybody else, all the other girls got one, and her daughter didn't. And she said a new kid moved into town and came to our school and was in her class, and before anybody else would be able to meet her and blackball my daughter to them, I invited her over, and she came over, and we had a nice night with the two kids together. I got them a video, they watched it, and got them a pizza. And then the next morning I got up, and the kids were already downstairs in the kitchen, and I came down, and my daughter is sitting there feeding her face, and the other kid has nothing to eat. And I said to her, Jenny, don't you want something to eat? And the kid nodded and said, yeah, that would be nice. And so I got her something to eat, and she said, I didn't say anything to my daughter then, but as soon as the kid left, I grabbed her and said, look, when you are the host, you take care of feeding your guest first, and you do not take care of feeding yourself first. And she said, my daughter just looked at me and wondered why I was so upset about it. And she said, well, she just didn't say she wanted anything. Bright kid, very logical. But she said there was another incident which was also different. She said, on my daughter's birthday, we gave her some fancy shampoo that she thought was really, really nice. And we paid a little extra money for it because it's something she wanted. And at this school, which is a private school, they would take showers after sports. And often the girls would wash their hair there because they had good hair dryers and so forth. And she said she came home one day when she had taken that bottle of shampoo into the school for the showers, and she said, all the girls were saying to me, hey, that's such neat stuff, I've heard about that, could I try it? And the mother said, well, what did you say? And she said, no. And I said, well, that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. And she said about 3 or 4 weeks later, my daughter came home, and she was absolutely indignant. And I said to her, what's the matter? I can tell there's something upsetting you. And she said, I was at school and I needed to wash my hair because I was all sweaty, and I was out of shampoo, and I asked, and nobody would give me any shampoo. And the mother said, well, do you think that might have anything to do with the fact that the other day you had your shampoo a few weeks ago and you wouldn't give anybody anything? And the daughter said, no, I didn't have any. Now, do you see how she's thinking? In the case of the other girls, they had shampoo and they just wanted to try it because it was a new thing and it was supposed to be super cool. In this case, it was her situation that she didn't have any shampoo and she needed some. Logically, she is correct. Psychologically, she is absolutely wrong. She could not anticipate how those other girls were going to feel about her turning them down on her shampoo and about her asking on their shampoo. That's the kind of thing that you see with ADHD kids with Asperger's, that often they are very logical and very poor at understanding things from a psychological point of view. And as a result, many of them get victimized and bullied by other kids. They also have a unique ability to piss off other kids in terms of, all right, what did you get on the social studies test? What? You got just an 80? I got 100. I thought that was a really easy test. Think about how well that goes over the 15th time. These problems with emotional intelligence are complex. It is far easier to teach an 8-year-old how to factor a quadratic equation than it is to teach them why a joke is funny in one situation and not in another. Those are very complex social judgments. It depends on who's in the room, what's just been said, what are people talking about, and what are the associations that may come from the joke. And these things are based on neural circuitry and body chemistry, not just on what you've learned by watching other people. Because the fact is, many of these things that we're talking about in terms of savoir-faire, socially, are things which nobody ever teaches you explicitly. You pick them up intuitively. People with Asperger's do not pick these things up intuitively. What you need to do is eventually help them learn how to use their intellect to be able to learn stuff that most other people pick up intuitively. There also are problems with temper that persist well into adulthood and that can be very costly in relationships. Let me just give this one more case example. This is a woman talking about her husband. She said, it doesn't take much for my husband to lose his temper. Usually he's a pretty good mood, but then all of a sudden some little frustration will set him off. Maybe somebody else has eaten the last of his favorite breakfast cereal, or one of our kids forgets to bring the trash cans from the driveway into the garage. All of a sudden he's shouting at the top of his lungs and getting in your face about how nobody in the house cares about anything and how we're all inconsiderate and lazy and worthless, never doing anything right, regardless of how many times he reminds us. So far, he's never hit any of us. But in those moments, it always seems like he just might. Usually this lasts for just a few minutes, and later he'll always apologize, but it's hard to forget those comments he makes. Seems like when he gets mad, all he can feel or think about is how mad he is. He can't remember that the people he's yelling at are people he loves and cares about. He forgets that we can get hurt by what he says, especially when he comes on so strong with it. I've tried to talk with him about this, and he always feels bad afterwards, but it keeps on happening. I know he loves me, and he loves our kids, but sometimes you wonder. And you see how that's an example of how the emotion just gobbles up all the space in his head, and it's very difficult for him to feed out, to be able to get it under control. I'm sorry that I haven't got enough time to be able to go through the whole thing. I'm just getting flagged that I'm going to have to pack up and go catch a cab to get to the airport. There is more information about this stuff on my website if you want to download some of these papers, and a lot of it is in this book, which I believe is available upstairs if anybody wants some. Thank you very much for your attention.